Okay, that's the end of our three speeches. We now have an opportunity to take some questions from the floor. I think we have some roving mics going around, our volunteers up there. So if people would like to ask questions, then we're very limited on time. We don't want to run into our coffee break, so we have only about 20 minutes. So I'd rather take questions rather than long statements. Do I have any hands?
Hugh McDermott. With regard to Ivan's statement of rankings in Europe, I think we reach a stage in Ireland where people suffer from well-being myopia in some ways, in that we see 30% as 80%. And in answering questions, this comes out. I've studied Paulo Freire, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in recent times, and feel that we live in an oppressed society, which doesn't reflect the statistics that truly reflect the statistics that are coming out. So I'd like some comments on that.
Mentioned very briefly in terms of the speeches, but one of the other indicators of how happy people are is how they actually vote. And in the areas where there's a high concentration of people who are not well off, they voted for parties like Sinn Féin and people for profit. I think the Labour Party, the latest is what, 5%, it's on its way out. So, I mean, you have a situation where there's a big transformation in how people vote. So in your analysis, how much do you take into consideration that as a factor of judgment of well-being?
I have a question for Charles Seaford. The figure of 4.4%, I was wondering, is that a once-off kind of drop in GDP, or does it relate to growth rates?
Okay, thank you. I think I'll ask Charles to deal with that specific question first, and then we can go on to the other two questions. Charles?
Yeah, it's a once-off. Sorry. It's a once-off, yeah. It's a once-off fall in GDP. It's not a permanent reduction in the growth rate.
Okay, so the other two questions were around a well-being myopia. That was directed at Ivan, and also a question of how this relates to how people vote, and particularly I think in reference to the local, the recent elections. Ivan, do you want to start us off?
Okay, yeah, the well-being myopia question. Are you agreeing, so to speak, with the hypothetical thesis that I'm proposing, sir? If you could just, is that?
In terms of our improvement in the economy and improvement in Ireland and improvement in well-being are not reflective. And I think what has happened is that our view of well-being is being reduced to levels that well-being of, if I take a figure of 30%, is being viewed as an 80% well-being, because the person who's been asked the questions in the survey is viewing their life as it is at the moment, compared to a very debased well-being situation.
And I mean, that's essentially what the evidence, one of the explanations is, that people are adjusting their expectations to their circumstances. I think it's important again to just return to this distinction in relation to the topic at issue here, which is subjective well-being rather than an overall measure of objective well-being. So what I've been indicating here is that in terms of subjective well-being, people's self-reported happiness appears to be holding up relatively well, let's say, okay, in comparison to what one would expect, given the overall objective drop in well-being more generally understood. So what is the explanation for that? And what I've attempted to do there is just posit a thesis. And then I suppose there's a cause and effect element of it. Is the being so good at engaging, which is what we are as a people, has that got some protective factor in it that protects us against the what would be naturally understood fall in personal happiness that one would expect to experience given the circumstances that we've been through. And that's essentially what I'm seeking to encourage further study in, and certainly that we in the Wheel will be doing some more work in relation to that. Like, for example, subjective well-being levels have been affected more severely in the other countries that have experienced the kind of social and economic crisis that we've been through. Our numbers have held up higher than the levels in Spain, for example, where subjective well-being has been much more seriously affected, and in Greece, of course, where it's been much more seriously affected as well. But then the question also, to come back to Charles's basic point, or one of the implications of Charles's point, is that there is a connection between income. There is a connection between income and happiness. There is a connection between social services and happiness. So to what extent is the fact that our national subjective well-being levels have held up to do with the fact, perhaps, that the severity of the impact has been less in Ireland than it has been in some of the other countries affected. So I just think there's lots of interesting material there to explore further.
Okay, thanks, Ivan. Charles is just going to jump in quickly on that point, and then Helen's going to address the other question. Yeah.
I just want to make a point about cross-sectional and time series data for countries very quickly. I mean, if you look at the overall level of life satisfaction in several countries, it appears to have been constant for 30 years. And people then say, oh, that means that income, GDP doesn't matter, and so on and so forth. The point is, that would mean that nothing matters. All the changes that have happened in the UK, say, since the 1970s, appear to have made no difference to life satisfaction whatsoever. It's not just income, it's everything. So there's very, very problematic interpreting aggregate time series data on well-being. If you look at the cross-sectional data, you get a lot more interesting information about what matters, what doesn't matter, whether you should put money into, care homes or roads or blah blah blah. Then you get there's a wealth of stuff, and you can make real decisions. I just want to. I think that the time series data is very problematic.
Thanks, Charles. Helen, you're going to address the question of how this links to how people vote.
Yeah, I mean, the well-being literature does capture that, and quite often it asks about democracy, to what extent people think their views matter, to what extent that they can engage in influencing decisions, to what extent do they trust the government and so on. And so obviously the extent to which people can vote and do vote is reflected in some of those indicators.
Charles, you want to just add something?
Just very quickly, I mean, since we've been talking in the last 2 or 3 years, our well-being work, increasingly the issue of using the whole well-being debate to in some way revive interest in voting, to revive democratic participation. I mean, one of the reasons why well-being has some kind of purchase, I think, is because people are dissatisfied with voting as a method of affecting change, and they think the political system has become congealed, certainly in the UK, has become congealed, and you can't do anything with it. So well-being and thinking about what public participation in the process of defining what well-being might mean becomes an alternative to that.
And then one small point from
and thank you. Just to respond to one of Charles's points there. So, in my presentation, I did note the fact that are we to conclude from it that there is no useful purpose served in measuring subjective well-being? Okay, that is one of the possible conclusions one can come to. But if you look at the falls that have taken place, as the World Happiness Index demonstrated in other countries in relation to subjective well-being, and the reports of that have not occurred to Ireland to the same degree, okay, there is something very, very important in there that relates to the thesis that I've made. Okay, so just to be completely clear about that.
I think that's probably true. There are variations, but the problem is it's quite difficult to identify what's driving it. I mean, it's not difficult; it's impossible actually from this statistical way.
Okay, so I think that we agree on that last point. And there was a hand up here in the last round, and there was one here. Anyone else? And over here. So there was a question here earlier on. Yeah, you sir with the pink shirt. Yeah. Sorry, just wait for someone to get across to you.
Hello, sorry, Edward Murphy is the name. Just wondering, is it possible to achieve what's been laid out here with regard to reconfiguring the distribution of well-being, if you like, without institutional reform, or to what extent do you think institutional reform at the political level is important with regard to impacting on policy and policy making, policy design? with regard to achieving the outcomes that are stated here today.
Okay, thanks for that. There was a question here, the gentleman here with the check shirt.
Hello, Tom O'Connor. It's just a comment on all three, but in particular, Charles, I would suggest that your analysis is rather what I'd call static. You had a graph there of the 7-point kind of satisfaction scale, and what you showed was that people at the top level of income, were fairly coordinated with satisfaction. People with lower income had lower levels of satisfaction. And you present it as if that is just the way it is, that there's no connection. Some lucky people at the top with high income, some unfortunate people lower down with lower income, and there's no connection. And I would refer to that as being very static analysis. I'd suggest there is a connection. I mean, we recently had an example of the company, the multinational in the Southeast, forcing the workers to take a reduction in pay, 200 redundancies. So presumably that increases the profits for the company. The 1% at the top will get more income, a bit more satisfaction. And if you heard interviews with the workers after that, they were pretty fed up, to put it very mildly, And I think there is a connection, and I think that's kind of a weakness in the analysis, as if there is no connection.
Have you a specific question?
Well, I suppose in that sense, I'll use an old-fashioned term, and what I have in mind is the top 1% exploiting a lot of the people at the bottom. Do you ever try to take that into your analysis?
Okay, and then we have time for one more question, and there's a lady in the middle there on the right-hand side.
Thank you, Alison Gilliland. Ivan, you highlighted the high above-average givingness in Ireland. Do you think, therefore, that this suggests that we're culturally more acceptable of giving more income tax proportionate to our earnings? Or perhaps is our supposed alleged resistance to higher tax linked to the apparent lack of a focus on well-being and how those taxes are spent?
Okay, so I'll turn these over to the panel now. The first question was around, do we require institutional reform and how that's linked to well-being? There was a question on exploitation and inequality, and is that taken into account? And finally, about the givingness of our society. Helen, do you want to address these?
I suppose the easy answer to the first question is yes. The more difficult question is what and how. So while you might suggest that we need institutional reform, I think we need to think through what that reform might be. Since the crash, there has actually been quite a lot of institutional reform, maybe not at central political level, but at local level and in the public service delivery institutions, I think particularly of FOSS and education and training, social welfare and so on. But and politically, there's been some change at local level. But it's how this change comes about and what it seeks to achieve ultimately, I think, is where the important debate lies, and where is the forum or the opportunity to discuss that.
Ivan, do you want to come in?
Just in relation to in relation to the question in relation to income and happiness and the exploitation question, there is an important point that needs to be clearly made in relation to the World Happiness Report's subjective well-being information, and that is that it does not measure the distribution of happiness. It's an aggregate number. So what we're not in a position to talk about is the extent to which the level of happiness is distributed within the society, or subjective well-being. And that's a very important next step that needs to be taken, a vital next step, if the information is to avoid simply becoming another undifferentiated measure, essentially the same as the GDP measure for all intents and purposes. So that's just something important to note. In relation to the high givingness culture point, I think it's a very interesting one. I wonder, is there a dark side to the high givingness kind of culture, if you see what I mean, in relation to understanding it fully? Or are we a culture that has developed a kind of an element of self-reliance, I suppose it might be described as, or community reliance in the face of inadequate social services, health services, education services over generations, and is part of that then so there's a good side to that, okay? There's a good side, and that's what we're kind of talking about here. But there's also perhaps a dark side, and that dark side may be to do with the fact that we're suspicious in some way, or not willing to make the collective contribution. We rather have a certain element of control, perhaps, over our shared futures. So there's some really profound stuff in there that needs to be unpacked in relation to this whole question around our level of community engagement and all of that sort of stuff.
Okay, and Charles is just going to come in on...
Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, on institutional reform, two things. Integrated policy making is going to be important, because if you're considering well-being, you're considering the ultimate outcome and the interactions between different policies. And I think maybe that's why the Scottish experience is interesting, because they have, alongside the national performance framework, tried to integrate the different parts of government more effectively. And with that as well could come reform of the way that finance ministries operate and the way they prioritise things, so that they prioritise more in terms of well-being than they do now. So I think institutional reform is absolutely vital. On the exploitation point, I just agree with you, basically, but it just wasn't the nature of the analysis I was doing. I mean, I could have done that, but I don't disagree with you at all. And just a small point on giving and tax. Giving is associated with high levels of well-being. Paying tax is not associated with high levels of well-being. Now, this suggests that the well-being you get from giving is less connected with the outcomes that giving produces, but with the sense of self-efficacy and generosity and so forth and so forth. So I'm afraid that's not such a nice result, is it?
Thank you, Charles. I think that's all really that we have time for.